Thank you very much, Mark. Some of you know I like to use maps, and then with a laser pointer, and you point to things and say, "See this here." Now I'll have to say, "See the second diagram." Look down on the right. But anyway, actually, could I have one of those? I don't have one. Okay, I want to look at the relation between Islam and Christianity, or probably, if we could use these terms, the relation between Christendom, and I think we should have the equivalent term, Islamdom. There's not the religions per se, but cultural and civilizational areas which tend to have been shaped by them. So, two background themes here. I look at that history to see what it reveals about current Islamist radicalism and what we might expect in terms of that. And there's two things I want to encourage you to do in terms of this presentation. As Christians, like most of us are Christians, we take our own beliefs seriously. At least I hope and pray we do. That means we should take other people's religions and beliefs seriously. There's a great tendency in the modern age amongst journalists, diplomats, analysts, and others to always treat religion as superstructural. When there's an issue, when there's a conflict, when something's going on which seems to be religious, you say, well, we need to look beneath it. Let's find the real reason, so that religion is always treated as an epiphenomenon. Sometimes it may be, of course, but we have a sort of systematic attempt simply not to take it seriously. And a lot of people die because we don't take it seriously. And the other thing we need to take seriously is history and geography. That's two things. Americans, obviously not all Americans, but for many Americans, there's a tendency to dismiss not only not to know it, but to dismiss it. Very few cultures would have the American expression, "That's history," meaning it's not important. For most people in the world would say, "That's history," which means it's damn well important. It's central. It tells how we got here, which means it tells us where we are. So you would find, from Saddam Hussein, or referring to George W. Bush as Halugu. What would that mean to us? Nothing. If you're an Iraqi, it would. The leader of the Mongols who destroyed Baghdad in 1258 and killed more people in 48 hours than the Crusaders had done in 2 centuries. Or the late Osama bin Laden, always going on about Al-Andalus, Andalusia, Spain. Or al-Baghdadi, referring always to the Caliphate, which was something our journalists had used to dismiss. So they're full of historical reference, which they assume their target audience, they would get the reference, and often we don't. And I think that's something we, as much as we can, we should change. Ambrose Bierce wrote a piercingly sarcastic book, many of them actually. One is called The Devil's Dictionary, which I recommend. It was written about 120 years ago. It has various definitions of terms such as politics, the use of public resources for private benefit, and under war, The Devil's Dictionary says, war is God's way of teaching Americans geography. A quip a little too true to be entirely funny. I think the same is also with history. So I want to go through these maps. So if you look at page 1, top left, we'll go sort of across, down, diagonal down, and usual PowerPoint 6. The one with the purple. You will see on this map, you're all young, so I'm assuming you can all read this. I actually can't. But there are 3 shades of purple. The dark purple centered in Arabia, centered around Mecca and Medina. This is the area ruled by the Muslims under Muhammad at the time of Muhammad's death. I usually put it 632. So a thing to note about Muhammad, he was successful. He died a little young, but he founded a new religion. He founded a new state and ruled it. He was a general. He led armies in battle and won most of them. So he's successful in a worldly sense in a way that, for example, Jesus was not. And after he died, most religions often collapse at that point. Islam continued. So you have the median purple. That's 661, at less than 30 years after Muhammad's death. We're looking at Arab-Muslim armies on the Atlantic and moving through Persia and also right up the Caspian Sea. Go to 750, we could even do 730, into Spain and France. And then moving that eastern part there is western China, the Talas River. And the big river on the right there is the Indus, in India. So 100 years after Muhammad's death, Muslim armies are in France, 200 miles south of Paris, and in India and China and what is now Russia, and controls a huge swathe in between. Whatever else can be said about this, it's quite a stunning achievement. We say, well, this was an imperial expansion. It was. But if the Byzantines could have done it, it would. It wasn't like everybody else in the world was a pacifist, and these people went around invading other people. Empires invade the places they can. So you have this mammoth expansion from the beginning. It continues. Moving to the right on the map, you'll see a green, those with young and sharp eyes will see a green line going across the Mediterranean, then moving down in sub-Saharan Africa, then way down the east coast of Africa to what is now Mozambique, then up into India, moving down the Indus Valley into what is now eastern India and Bangladesh, moving north into what is Central Asia and Turkey. This is the situation in 1100, a continuing expansion. Move one down to the left, very similar looking map. We're looking at 1500. Not too much movement in Africa, but in Asia now moving down through what is now Malaysia into Indonesia, and the map is wrong, it should include the southern Philippines, but then expansion northwards into Central Asia and what is now Russia, and with the collapse of Constantinople moving into the Balkans. So taking Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Austria. So taking over those areas. Moving to the map next to it, the one with the red, a simplified version. The red area is places at one time ruled by Muslims. You'll note that includes in land area over half of Europe. Okay, so you have this area. And so we see from roughly 632 to almost 1,000 years later, there were various setbacks along the way, but almost continuous expansion. And that red area is the center of the world. It's where the three major continents meet. At this point, the Americas are irrelevant. And militarily more powerful, politically more powerful, in many ways culturally more powerful in terms of philosophy, literature, other things. In terms of wealth, access to foodstuffs. Europe was sort of cold, wet, not particularly powerful. India was controlled largely by Muslims. China kept within its border. So this was the dominant civilization. So if you were a Muslim who believed that your religion was the final religion, the final revelation, and would bring success and God's rule over the earth, then mundane history was quite congruent with sacred history, if we can use those terms. Everything about you would tell you that yours is the true religion, the real religion, the final religion. Why? Because we had brought all of this success. So we have 1,000 years, in general terms, 1,000 years of stunning success. But then things change, as we now know. Things don't, as you know in history, things don't just change on a dime. They take time. You don't just win everything and start losing everything. You start to lose a few more battles than you used to, and then you start losing more than you win, and then you're losing a lot, and you're being pushed back. So there was this slow turning point over centuries, but if you wanted my apologies to those who had this part of it on 2 nights ago, if you wanted a symbolic date to mark the high watermark of much of the Muslim world, the date would be September 11, 1683. This is when Ottoman armies were again camped outside of Vienna. And on the 12th, they were defeated. They'd lost battles before. They were sort of driven back from Vienna early in 1525. But this was a pretty bad defeat, followed by other defeats, and then a full-scale retreat, not a withdrawal, and they were chased. And slowly you had a continuing expansion. So what happened is, after 1,000 years of relatively stunning success, the world Islamdom started to suffer crippling defeat at the hand of Christendom or the Christians. We tend to categorize these things in terms of countries, with French, British, whatever. Discussions at the time, and indeed for a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, those things are irrelevant. It's Muslims, it's infidels, it's crusaders. You use religious language to describe these things. So, and the response from Christendom can be described very broadly, huge generalization, in 3 waves. The first is, we've just alluded to this, is after the failure of the Siege of Vienna, and these overlap in time over a period of centuries, the pushback of the Ottomans out of Europe, majority Christian territories. So the bottom right map of the Ottoman Empire, light brown is the extent of the Ottoman Empire run out of Istanbul in 1683, the year I've just alluded to. And in 1914 is the dark brown. So 75% of the territory gone, and by the time we get to 1918, it's pretty well disappeared. So you have the retaking of Serbia, Romania, Hungary, Austria, large chunks of Russia and the Crimea, what is now the Ukraine, and moving on into Central Asia. So there's this sort of push out of Europe, including European Russia. The second phase, if we turn over again, top left on page 2, same map, but to get a picture of the world, is what we usually call colonialism, or European maritime imperialism. Because the Muslim world was, had this huge chunk from the Atlantic to China, if you wanted to trade with China and other places, it was quite difficult. People traded with each other. People weren't just spending the whole time making war and invading each other. But it's quite expensive to buy something in China and sort of haul it all the way over through a dozen principalities. Each would levy taxes and other things on it. So you wanted to get around the Muslim world, which is also seen as something of an enemy. So the Portuguese went one way, they went down and around Africa and sailed to the east. Columbus went the other way. They were trying to sail around the Islamic world in both cases, and began trading, but also began fighting and taking over lands. So The Portuguese were taking over various areas in West and East Africa, also the India subcontinent, also on the Arabian Peninsula. Took over Aden. And indeed, there was an expedition mounted to invade Mecca in, I think, 1509 by the Portuguese. But what you mainly had, trade, small levels, but growing through the centuries in the 18th and 19th centuries. The takeover of most of Africa, of the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia. So the Dutch take Indonesia, the Spanish have the Philippines, the British have Malaysia, what is now Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and so forth. And then also a carve-up of Britain, France, Spain in terms of West Africa and elsewhere. So this colonial expansion is, who are they taking over from? When the British conquered India, in the south there were Hindu rulers who were displaced. But for most of India, the powerful rulers were, of course, Muslims. Similarly in Pakistan or Bangladesh. Similarly in Malaysia. Similarly in Indonesia. Similarly in West Africa and East Africa. You saw how that expansion went down the side of East Africa. So you have Christian infidel powers taking over control from Muslims right throughout the world. In Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia. So the pushback in Europe, sort of out of Christian majority areas, then the takeover of maybe not majority Muslim population, but places largely under Muslim control, all those peripheral areas. So those are the first two phases. And then the third one is a move into the heartland of Islam, the Arabic-speaking world, the greater Middle East. So if we look at the map with the colors on the right, this is a layout of the form of rule in the Middle East in the year 1925. What had already happened is the French had, of course, invaded North Africa, Morocco, Algeria. The Italians had gone over there to Libya. The French had invaded Egypt in 1798. The British took it over from there. So a lot of the Middle East was being carved up by the European powers. And because the Ottomans allied with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians in the First World War, they were defeated. So the remnants of most of their empire in the Middle East were given, the British got what is now the Palestinian areas, Israel, Jordan, the French got Syria, Lebanon, Brits also got Iraq, as some mandates territories to govern until they could perhaps be self-governing. And the only areas which, Muslim majority areas at this point actually being run by Muslims would have been, if you look at that map, Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan, and then the Arabian Peninsula. Well, Afghanistan is remote. Turkey was being run by a secularist, Ataturk, who made French secularism look positively religion-friendly. Abolished the headgear, got rid of Arabic script. Women could not wear a head covering in government buildings and other places. Very strong secular push. So he was nominally a Muslim, but this didn't look like an example of Muslim rule, and Iran was similar. So the only substantial territory with Muslim population actually being run by Muslims is the Arabian Peninsula. Meanwhile, Ataturk abolishes the Caliphate, the nominal ruler of all the Muslims in the world from the Philippines to the Atlantic. Of course, the Caliph had, after the first couple of decades, the Caliph had never really ran this thing. But there was always the idea that there was somehow a Muslim ruler, there was a commonality of our beliefs, and then Ataturk just gets rid of this. So this is very much the low point in Muslim rule. Let me just quote one person who commented on this quite a bit, and that's Osama bin Laden. Looks back on this. On November 3, 2001, he had other videos after September 11. This is the first big one. In that videotape broadcast, he said, following World War I, which ended more than 83 years ago, the whole Islamic world fell under the Crusader banner, under the British, French, and Italian governments. They divided the whole world. One would need to add some qualification to that, but it's an accurate remark. So the Muslim world has come from that red one, second page, middle left, of those areas being ruled, to this little fragment in the Middle East of the only really Muslim self-governing area in the Arabian Peninsula. The rest of it was substantially under the control of infidels. Things changed with, even in Arabia. In the first Gulf War, a group of American soldiers and others appeared and say, hello, we're from America, we're here to help. And again, just to quote bin Laden on this, he calls this the latest and greatest aggression. Now infidels walk on the land where Muhammad was born and where the Quran was revealed. The only place in the Muslim world they haven't yet come. And now they're here. So, if you look at this history, you see 1,000 years of success, 300 years of grinding failure, and you, so to speak, see the walls closing in. They're taking over everything. So if American troops, we say, well, we came in there, the Saudis asked us to because Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and Saudi was next, so they helped. But if you're looking at long-term historical patterns, you don't have to be so paranoid to say, look where they are now. So to understand this history is very important to understand in understanding many Muslims, not just radicals, not just terrorists, but this cycle of 1,000 years of success, 300 years of failure. Why? Title of Bernard Lewis's book, What Went Wrong? And there are many answers offered, but to simplify, there are two major ones. One is we've been left behind, we've been superstitious, we haven't thought, we haven't learned from others, we thought we knew everything and we were right and final, and slowly we've just fallen behind in terms of science, governance, democracy, human rights, literature, or whatever. We need to learn from others and be open to the modern world. And the other answer is almost the diametrically opposite. That when we were good Muslims, when we were good, strict, we followed Islamic Sharia law, then we were successful. When we turned away from it and started chasing after Western or other ideas like the emancipation of women or human rights or democracy or any of these infidel ideas, then we were a failure. We've been crushed. So what do? We need to get back to what we were. So at heart, many of these movements we're talking about, and here I'm not talking about terrorists per se, but groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hizb ut-Tahrir and others, we need to get back to a pure Islam. It's a revivalist movement within the Muslim world, which can have very strict elements, and then it has violent elements, because many Muslims refuse to be revived in quite the way people like ISIS want them revived. They might want other ways. And so you use coercion on Muslims in the Middle East to get them to get with the program. But that, in the case of Al-Qaeda, The analysis is our coercion isn't working because places like Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia are being backed by America, by the infidels, the far enemy. So we must attack America to get it to break its alliances with these powers in the Middle East, and when that is done, then we can take over the places we want in the Middle East and begin to renew Islam. For ISIS, that's much too slow, much too cumbersome. They said, we lost the Caliphate. The solution is to regain the Caliphate. So for someone like Baghdadi, who I think we now believe is still alive, says, we go straight to the Islamic State. Let me quote from him. The Islamic State, after they conquered areas in northern Syria, northern Iraq, by God's bounty, we possess all the constituent elements of the Caliphate, which Muslims have been sinning for failure to establish. It is clear that there is now no impediment or legal excuse to absolve the Islamic State of the sin of its delaying. Or there's no excuse for not establishing the Caliphate, the Islamic State. So you go straight to it. And the idea there is we control this territory, we call believing Muslims to come and join us and fight, and we continue to expand. And we expand until we get to bottom left. That is a map from the black and gray one. That's an ISIS map from one of their many websites outlining the Caliphate. And if you compare that map to the one with the red on the right, you'll notice they're substantially the same, except for some reason they decided to leave out Southeast Asia and India. But it's the restoration, basically, we want to restore that red area. So these are the ideas underpinning a lot of terrorism and non-terrorist forms of Islam. And if we want to understand them, it has to be against this history, a religious history, a religious grievance. There are lots of local, Muslim terrorists who fight about Kashmir or about Israel and so on. But if we're looking at the global movements, it's a global strategy, and they fight in all of these areas. In August, we report terrorist attacks obviously in Barcelona, Paris, and elsewhere. But remember, in August, in Finland, Finland's not even a member of NATO. In Burkina Faso and other areas, this is very much global. It's not much in our news, but ISIS controls a fairly substantial town, city in the southern Philippines as we speak, which they have taken over, and the Philippine military have not been able to dislodge them. This is very much a global thing. So we need to be careful about projecting Western categories of foreign policy on what is happening there. So, in conclusion, as Christians, we need to take our own beliefs seriously. That also means we need to take Muslims of all kinds, but in this context, particularly radical Muslims, to take what they say seriously and not project our own categories upon them. And thirdly, particularly now in the United States in these days, we need to take history seriously. Most of these things are virtually unknown to most Americans of this history. So with for these three exercises to you as students and as professors, I would commend them to you, and will now be open for questions. Thank you very much.
I'm Brian Benson from George Mason University. I have a sort of an abstract question. It's a hypothesis. I call it the millennial theory of history. Rome lasted 1,000 years. You have described Islamdom, which lasted 1,000 years. And Rome, you know, it's not like with the collapse of the Roman Empire in 450. That was the end. You had fascist Italy reasserting the Roman dream 1,500 years ago. So I think the idea that exactly what you're describing about ISIS is kind of equivalent to this, a resurrection, but that in terms of the broad sweep of history, the millennial theory of history, that frankly, Islam pooped out by, what's your word, year 1689.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my hypothesis. It's a question. It's a question.
Is the relation of fascist Italy to the memory of Rome parallel to the memory of ISIS? I think there's probably something in that. I'd never thought that before. You pick up the symbols. It reminds me of Marx's comment on Hegel when Hegel said history repeats itself. He said he forgot to add the first time as drama, the second time as farce. But let me just add one. I don't want to take the time for this, but when you mention the Roman Empire lasted 1,000 years, that's a Western view. The I'm talking about the Byzantine Empire. I mean, they moved the capital. Constantine lived in Constantinople, what is now Istanbul. The Byzantine Empire was the Roman Empire, and it fell in 1453. And of course, the Russians say it never fell because they moved it to Moscow, the Third Rome. And that's when the rulers, princes of Moscow, took the title, the Roman title, of course, Caesar, Tsar. And it is the Third Rome, and they had all the titles. The Tsar was the Holy Roman Emperor and whatever, and others did. But again, you get that echo there. Russia does see itself really, I mean, Putin is doing a million things, but part of that is a view that we are the defenders of the Christians in the Middle East. They play that a lot. Okay, yep, hit the front. Oh, I thought that was, you were waving earlier. Oh, you're waiting for the mic, sorry.
Thank you. A few questions. Ted Mormon, one is, to what degree do the first 1,000 years of expansion in this, in these maps reflect coercion? And I guess, to what degree are kind of the same motivations being used today in ISIS? And then finally, what kind of rhetoric should our current administration be using to deal with this threat?
Why? In terms of coercion, if we look at, say, one of those maps, if we look at the invasions of the Middle East, North Africa, moving up into Russia with the Tartars and the Golden Horde and so on, then over particularly into what is now Pakistan and India, those were invasions by armies taking over control. The moves across the Sahara into what is now the Sahel varied, that there were conflicts and wars in that too, but a lot of migration, trading, things of that kind. And the move into Southeast Asia, largely peaceful. In Indonesia, probably the place of these I know best, Islam came peacefully. Christianity came with, well, it came with traders, but traders with guns. So, but that early expansion, India and points west, largely through force. And I think you see reflections of the forms. I think that's affected us to this day with a lot of African Islam and a lot of South and Southeast Asian Islam being very different from much of the Muslim world. Let me just commend a book which I commended the other day by Lamin Sanneh called After Jihad, came out last year. He's an emeritus professor at Yale, member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. It's called After Jihad, subtitle, The Pacifist Tradition in West African Islam. Not just the nonviolent thing, he says the pacifist tradition. So you get some of those. If you look at places now, Timbuktu was always the image of the back and beyond, but it was a major theological center. And when after we assisted in the collapse of Libya, when the ISIS-affiliated people seized the arms and then immediately invaded, went south into what is now Mali, their target was the libraries in Timbuktu. They wanted to destroy all the records of other forms of Islam. And we're talking traditions 600, 700, 800 years, going back 600, 700, 800 years. So that's, so two phases in what is now our military district of the Middle East, Pakistan West, invasion in other places, mixed but often trading, peaceful missionaries type of thing. In terms of what language we use now, as you know, we have major fights. Do you call these people jihadis or something? Well, people are now doing it. You can't control the language that much. But the argument is, well, jihad has positive associations for many Muslims, so you aren't you sort of complimenting them in a way? I think, ask Mary Haybeck when she's here, because she's a very good book on Islamist military strategies. But what I recommend is don't get into fights about the use of abstract titles for things. People say, well, should we say this is really Islam or whatever? I just go straight to the point about something. Say, they do this because of their interpretation of this in the Quran, this in the Hadith, and you just say what it is they're doing. And it becomes screaming obvious to everybody that this is their interpretation of Islam, and without you having to say it, or whether this is true or false, or whether it's really related. So deal with the concrete relations. I think that's a way of getting out of some of our fruitless arguments on this. Yep.
Professor, good to see you again.
Okay.
Couple of just a thought.
Mike.
Oh. So when you talk about the expansion, okay, if we were to step back just a little bit and think about Islam as a philosophy versus a religion, not to say that it's not a religion, okay, a lot of it came from the Greco-Roman philosophy, same arguments, but the economy of the world was expanding in that area. So that's sort of my basis for the next sort of question. I believe a lot of the expansion happened through the Sunnah branch. Is that true? And
Yep.
then what was the relationship that the Shiites brought into this equation? Thank you.
Well, as you know, you had the battles of succession taking place in what is now Iraq. In simple terms, the Shia lost. So they hadn't done much expansion. They confined largely to Iraq and Iran as the heartland. Now in various forms, they ran Egypt for a while once, and then down in Oman, so there was scattering. But basically, it's the Sunnis who did all that expansion, and the Shia was sort of boxed in there as very much the weaker party. So.
The expansion is really Sunni.
It's a Sunni expansion, largely. Okay, way at the back. Yep.
Bruce Carson again, Regent University School of Government. You hit on a couple things, and a comment and a question. The first comment is, being in Afghanistan, I was deployed there for 13 months in the Arghandab River Valley. So it wasn't the type of experience where, hey, there is a known enemy, and we are a known force occupying there, and we're fighting against that known enemy. It was more so, to quote a book, The War of Ideas.
Yep.
So we now have a war of ideas going on between the West or Christianity and then between Islam. And so the notion that ISIL or ISIS will capitulate to, the modernity of the West, and that, hey, we want to give you all religious freedom, as long as you're not chopping off nobody's heads or, degrading women. But they're really not buying our brand of democracy. So in your view, with this whole war of ideas, what is the way ahead, not only for, I guess, ISIS, but also to open up a dialogue between Christianity and Islam?
There are obviously many levels that need to be in this conflict, including military ones. I was just looking for a quote on Al-Qaeda. As you know, so Al-Qaeda is not an organization; it's a series of ideas with shared by people. One of the things we need to do as much as possible is to reframe this away from Christianity versus Islam. And to Christians, and make it Christians, Muslims, and others, and secular people against radical Islam or radical Islamism or terrorism. One reason I spend a lot of time in Indonesia is because of the dominant, there's problems there too. Radicalism is growing. But the dominant forms of Islam tend to be very different in their relationship to local cultures and so on. And, you know, they let me, I won't be able to, this will be the last question I'll take, so I'll finish with a quote. The former Indonesian foreign minister, currently the president's special envoy to the Middle East and the Organization of the Islamic Conference, Alwi Shihab, at a dinner last year with a group of visiting Americans discussing these issues, said to us, he's also an Islamic scholar, has a PhD from Harvard, and has taught there. And he said, 15 years ago, you were fighting Al-Qaeda, and so were we. Now you're fighting ISIS, and so are we. I mean, they're getting bombed as well. He says, in 15 years from now, you'll be fighting somebody else. But it's exactly the same conflict. The people will change, the groups will change, but it's this, unless something is done about this ideology, even its theology, he will not shy away from that. He says it will continue. And he said, unless we combat these ideas, we can't do anything. He says, and in this, you need our help, because we can do that. But we need, speaking to the Americans, says, but we need your help, because nobody ever listens to us. And they do listen to you. He says, so we need to be friends. Thank you very much.